KTRS.
Coming up in just a minute, we're going to check in with Steven Portnoy, who was inside the Supreme Court yesterday as they heard the Defense of Marriage Act oral arguments. We'll get to that in just a second. 1 hour from now, we'll be checking in with Katie James. Katie James is a former Ellisville City Council member, and she is the one who presented the charges to remove Adam Paul. And remember, it all started with her 2 charges that she brought to the city council, which has led to him being suspended. And now, just a few days away, Monday is when they are planning to vote on whether or not to impeach and to remove Adam Paul from the mayor's office in Ellisville. This has blown into a major story, and the whole town is now watching what happens with this Ellisville City Council. Katie James heard the conversation yesterday we had with Chet Pleben, the attorney for Mayor Adam Paul, and she wants to respond. So we will give her all the time she needs and wants to get her point of the story out. So Katie James will be joining us at 8:20. That's 1 hour from now. Steven Portnoy is live in Washington, D.C. Good morning, Steven Portnoy.
Hey there.
Take us through what happened yesterday. I know you can't figure out or decipher the tea leaves, but what was the overall conversation like as they debated the Defense of Marriage Act?
Well, I'll tell you, court observers counted 5 justices who yesterday expressed skepticism of the Defense of Marriage Act, particularly Justice Kennedy. The key swing vote said that the government runs a real risk of intruding into areas that are traditionally the state domain, that is marriage, divorce, custody of children. And he said, he suggested at least, that there was a problem of federalism here, with the federal government for the first time in 1996 establishing a definition of that which has always been a state concern. And the idea is now that he would join, or could join, with the court's 4 more liberal justices to figure out a way to strike DOMA down. The liberals had particular concerns with the notion that it discriminates against the same-sex couples who are legally wed in 9 states and Washington, D.C., that can't, for example, file a joint tax return, among many things. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that the federal government now has 2 classes of marriage, what she called real marriage and then skim milk marriage.
Justice Scalia has well documented as standing up for states' rights. If it comes down to a states' rights issue, why wouldn't he be on the side of striking down a federal law like this?
That's a great question, and I felt that Scalia was notably silent during the arguments yesterday on that point. He never really approached it. There was one key moment where one of the opponents of Proposition 8, the lawyer, was trying to argue that it was motivated by anti-gay animus, and she was suggesting that there's been a sea change in the country since the law was passed in 1996 in this discussion of whether the law is discriminatory. And Scalia did pipe up then. He goes, well, what gives you that impression that views have changed? And she said, well, you could see it just in society. And he said, well, how many states now have same-sex marriage? And she said 9, and he goes, well, how many states don't? And, it's over 30. And he said, well, where's the evidence that there's this supposed sea change in views that towards homosexuality? But ultimately, on the federalism question, it wasn't clear where Scalia would come down. And maybe we'll wake up in June and read the opinion and find out that he joined with Justice Kennedy. But as far as it goes, the court was skeptical of a federal role. The liberals, in particular, were concerned about the notion that it discriminates against same-sex couples. But the lawyer for the law, Paul Clement, tried to argue that there is a reason for a national uniform standard of what marriage is because of now the emerging patchwork of laws between states. And the idea that people move from one state where there is same-sex marriage to a state that there isn't, that imposes a burden now on the federal government to keep track. But ultimately, state it does create marriage, and so that's why you had Justice Kennedy expressing that there was a risk that the federal law kind of sort of intervenes in that area.
It's interesting where we find ourselves on this political road. The White House is not defending a federal law, so House Republicans have, I guess, cobbled together some type of defense, and so they're the ones defending this Defense of Marriage Act. Talk to that for a moment, Steven Portnoy.
And that was a big part of yesterday's argument. There are procedural and standing questions that are unique and particular to these two cases, the Prop 8 case on Tuesday, the DOMA case yesterday, and the court will have to settle those disputes or those questions before ruling on the merits, if they even reach a ruling on the merits. Yesterday, the court spent an hour discussing whether the House of Representatives, as one House of Congress, has the right to come forward and defend a law that the executive won't. The conservative justices in particular were very skeptical of that and had real trouble with it. In fact, the first hour of argument yesterday was spent with the conservative justices mainly really expressing their displeasure with the idea of what Scalia called a new regime of the Justice Department just deciding that laws aren't constitutional and refusing to defend them. And it's particularly interesting, not to get too much into the weeds of all the legality of all this, but you had the Obama administration, which is responsible for enforcing this law, and the woman who's suing to overturn it on the same side of an argument. So the question is, where's the case? If both sides feel that there is no reason to bring it to the Supreme Court, you had the House of Representatives saying, well, we're going to stand for this law. Justice Roberts and Justice Scalia said it was unprecedented, and the question is whether that will be allowed to stand. Because Scalia was very worried that this sort of thing will happen again. Justice Alito said, well, what happens when the House just doesn't like the way a law is being enforced? Are we going to have cases like this all the time now? That was the question.
And the White House, though they still feel this is unconstitutional and not defending the law, the White House is still following the law, even though they feel it is unconstitutional.
That is correct. It is still enforcing it because the way the government lawyer described it, it respects the statute but wants to see it overturned. Ultimately, it's a tricky constitutional issue. I mean, you have the executive branch clearly feeling a law is wrong but following it because it's supposed to, and yet not defending it because it feels it's wrong, even though many people believe it's supposed to defend it too.
Steven Portnoy was inside the room. Anything you can tell us being inside the room that we wouldn't be able to get from the released audio?
Well, I'll tell you, it was an opportunity for the Supreme Court justices to face the woman who is bringing this case, an 83-year-old widow whose partner of more than 40 years passed away a few years ago. Edith Windsor is the survivor, and she is suing to overturn this law. She says she had to pay $363,000 in estate taxes that she wouldn't have owed if her longtime companion, partner, had been a male as opposed to a female. And she says that that's not fair, and it disrespects their relationship. She says the federal government treated them as strangers, even though they shared their lives together. So ultimately, the justices were presented with the real-life ramifications of all this. And when Justice Ginsburg spoke of, skim milk marriages, that the federal government is now sorting between real marriages and what she called skim milk marriages, that was a moment where people across the courtroom were kind of nodding their heads.
It's also interesting that House Republicans are going to the Supreme Court for forcing people to pay an estate tax.
Isn't that ironic? but yes, that's ultimately what we're talking about, yes.
Yeah. Steven Portnoy, live in Washington, D.C., inside the Supreme Court building. Steven Portnoy, great job, as always. Thanks for checking in. Happy Easter to you.
You bet, you too.
You got it. Steven Portnoy here, right? I mean, the House Republicans, ultimately it comes down to the cases, whether or not these two lesbians, one died, lifelong partners. She died. She had to pay $350,000 in estate taxes because all of the money was given over to this woman, this lesbian partner. She had to pay $360,000 in estate taxes. If they were married, she wouldn't have to pay that at all. No one's arguing that. So House Republicans are going to the Supreme Court to defend the law that forces this woman to pay her estate tax, even though they campaign as possible every single second they campaign against the estate tax, yet they want this woman to pay her estate tax. And they're so defiant about it and so right that they'll take it all the way to the Supreme Court to make sure this woman pays her estate tax. But they don't want any of us to pay an estate tax. 7:30 on the Big 550 KTRS.